The simile of the chariot is very famous in Buddhism, and we're going to tell a story about it. A somewhat speculative story, but we're going to geek out a bit and look at the deep history of language and culture, coming into the heart of really what Buddhist practice is, and at the end we're going to look at what might be a lesson in Buddhist feminism. So a bit of a geek out today, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. Also, if you're interested in a deeper dive into elements of the Dharma of early Buddhism, check out the courses that I have over on onlinedharma.org. The Chariot Simile is very famous in Buddhism in general, and it stems from early Buddhism, from ideas that go back to the origins of Buddhism. But the idea of a chariot, the idea of horses and carts and wheels, goes back thousands of years into the deep past. Buddhism, the Buddhist culture, came out of a general culture, a large culture that originated, as far as we know, in what's called the Pontic-Caspian steppes, which is a steppe area in what is present-day Ukraine and Russia, north of the Black Sea, I believe. And this culture is known as the Proto-Indo-European culture. It is a culture that we have come to know through studying language, the history of languages, as well as, more recently, through studying archaeology of this area. We know, for example, that the language of ancient India, which is Sanskrit, ancient Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, is related to languages in Europe, is related to Latin, is related to Greek, and all of these languages seem to come from an origin somewhere in between. And by looking at both the languages and the apparent culture of this area, we can tell a great deal about the culture in which all of these different cultures grew up, and where they all came from, where they all sort of originated from. And we can actually look at that. Well, I mean, some of the interesting things, there's been several books written about this. One of them is called, I believe it's the Horse, the Wheel, and Language. And indeed, these are elements that were important and indeed crucial to Proto-Indo-European culture. We can tell that by looking again at the language, by looking at the archaeology of the area. It was a pastoral culture. It was a pastoral culture in which people domesticated the horse and believed that the horse was very important to who they were. They also invented the wheel, and not just a wheel as used as a toy, as it is in many cultures, but used as a part of a cart, so that the horse would be attached to the cart, would be pulling the cart. It was used originally for either the horse or oxen in the same kind of situation to pull large, heavy loads. In particular, it could carry an entire household worth of goods if they wanted to move from one place to another. So some of the highlights of this culture, some of the cultural markers that we find involve horses, involve carts, involve oxen, eventually involve chariots. And the language that eventually becomes Buddhism, or at least the heart of Buddhist language, we know early Buddhist texts because they come from Pali, the language Pali. Pali language is a close cognate of Sanskrit. It's a dialect of Sanskrit. There are very many terms that are very, very similar, even identical between the languages. And Sanskrit began within, I should say the roots of Sanskrit go back to this Proto-Indo-European culture. And many of the terms that we find in early Buddhism, critical terms in Buddhism, spring out of the same cultural milieu, the same cultural background. So for example, we have the Dhammacakka, the wheel of the Dharma. Indeed, the Buddha's first sermon is known as the turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Now, we've just said that wheels are important to a Proto-Indo-European culture. They were the way that the culture, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the people who live in that culture, got around. They considered that critical to who they were. And so we find the word wheel so important in, again, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. We also find it important in the notion of the wheel-turning king or the wheel-turning monarch, who in early Buddhism is put up as the ideal ruler. So the ideal ruler is somebody who rules because of their control over wheeled implements, wheeled carts, wheeled chariots. They themselves would go around on chariots. Their warriors would go around on chariots, perhaps. And the wheel was considered sort of an emblem or symbol of who the ruler was. And indeed, even today, the wheel is used as a central emblem on the Indian flag, the Indian national flag. It comes from a symbol that we find in King Ashoka. The Ashokan pillars would at times be crowned by a wheel, which is supposed to indicate the wheel of the Dharma. Again, coming out of this Proto-Indo-European past. We also have the term yoga. Now, many of us nowadays will know yoga as a series of stretches and exercises that come out of Hinduism. Well, in fact, if we go back far enough, yoga comes out of really a confluence of ideas from Brahmanism, that is to say the antecedents to Hinduism, as well as early Buddhism. And these different ideas blended together. We have Yogacara Buddhism, which is yogic, I should say a school of Buddhism that is based around the idea of yoga. Yoga meaning a practice, a sort of a thing that we undertake, a set of practices or mental or physical techniques that we use. Those are known as yoga. And what does the word yoga really mean? Well, in Sanskrit, it really comes from the word for yoke. Indeed, it's cognate to our word for yoke. A yoke is something that you put over the neck and back of, in particular, oxen in order to allow them to pull the carts. So the word yoga comes from this idea of binding yourself to a particular practice, taking it upon yourself, in the same way that the oxen takes on the weight of the cart when they pull it. So we see that many of the concepts around the chariot grew up in this atmosphere of Proto-Indo-European cultural dominance in the area. But in Buddhism, its most famous use is in the simile, the simile of the chariot, where the chariot is used to express what it is, what the Buddhist idea of non-self is all about. So it comes up, it's probably, most people nowadays will look back to the Milinda Panyaha, which is a later Buddhist text that was written probably several centuries after the Buddha's lifetime. It's a dialogue between King Menander, or as it's called, Milinda, who was sort of a Greek influenced king in the area, and he has a discussion with Nagasena, who is a Buddhist monk. And it comes up the question of non-self. How do we make a sense of non-self? And this monk talks about the chariot simile. That is to say, that just as you can talk about a chariot being an actual thing, but when you look at it in more detail, it comes apart into pieces. So you have the axle, you have the wheels, you have the body of the chariot, you have the floor of the chariot, you have the pole that goes to the horse. I don't know the terms of these things, but the point is that there isn't a chariot above and beyond all these different pieces. It's just a collection of pieces put together in a certain way. So too, the self, the person, is just a collection of parts and pieces put together in a certain way. Now, this metaphor actually does not come from the Milinda Panyaha. It comes from an earlier text, in fact, a sutta from early Buddhism, where a nun named Vajira says just this, that herself is simply like a chariot made out of parts. Now the question is where Vajira got this idea. We've already said that the idea of chariots was around in the air, but where did she get this idea that a self can be taken apart into pieces just like a chariot might? Now, there's no easy answer to this. That is to say, she doesn't say where she got the idea, and so we have to, well, if we want to get any kind of an answer, we might speculate. And so that's what we're going to do here, a little geekish speculation on where she might have gotten this idea, because it actually goes back quite a bit, and there's a lot of interesting, indeed the symbol of the chariot, or the use of the chariot, is fundamental in many different descriptions of the Buddhist path, which we'll go into. Before I get there, though, I would love to take a couple of seconds to tell you about Patreon, which is the way that I try to help support this channel and keep third-party advertising off of it. I've just recently released a new benefit that you can get by signing up on Patreon. I'm putting access to show notes into Patreon. So if you would like to get the notes that I use to structure these videos of mine, plus all the different links and so on, you can get those by signing up on Patreon and take a look. I have other options as well in case you would like to have these in audio form or would like to get early access to these videos. There's lots of different options, so I suggest taking a look if it interests you, and if it doesn't, don't worry, we'll just keep coming out with videos and you can just watch these. Where does the Chariot Simile come from? Well, it's hard to say exactly, but it's used a lot in the early texts. In the early texts, the path of practice is often framed as a kind of training that we undergo. And it's compared to the training of horses, horse training. The way you would take a young horse and break it in and make it useful to the king's service, is how it's put in one sutta. And horses were generally at the time not used to ride upon the way we might nowadays, but they were used to pull carts and used to pull chariots. That was the typical use of a horse back in the day. So one good example from the early texts involves how we, as what's called, guard the sense doors. And I did an earlier video on this, I'll put a link to it up above. But the idea is, how are we supposed to have the right relationship to our senses, so to speak, where we aren't being taken in all the time by tempting things in the external world. This is a kind of practice that's given in particular to monastics. And it's said in one of these texts about guarding the sense doors, or the practice behind this kind of thing. It says, the Buddha says, suppose a chariot stood harnessed to thoroughbreds at a level crossroads, with a goad ready. Then a deft horse trainer, a master charioteer, might mount the chariot, taking the reins in his right hand and goad in the left. He'd drive out and back wherever he wishes, whenever he wishes. In the same way, a mendicant trains to protect, control, tame, and pacify these six senses. That's how a mendicant guards the sense doors. So while in this case what he's talking about is a master charioteer, clearly there's going to be a less master charioteers, that is, charioteers in training, who are going to be trying to take this goad and the reins and use the horse, and they're not going to be able to go wherever they want, whenever they want, because they're still in training. But the point is to get yourself to a situation where your horse is under your command. Your horse and your chariot are under your command. In the same way, we practice to train our senses so that they are under our command, so that they're not going to be pulling us this way and that where we don't really want to be going. In another early sutta, the Buddha compares badly behaved monks and nuns to colts who are not well trained. In the same way that a badly behaved monk, let's say, who has been reproved, who has been told he's doing something wrong, and doesn't take advice, is not willing to take the advice in the right spirit, he says is like a colt who is badly trained and who as a result throws off the chariot or perhaps breaks it into pieces. So there's a sense of mistraining. A monastic who is not properly trained is compared to this kind of horse and chariot that are not well trained. And in another early sutta, the Buddha compares the path of practice to what are called relay chariots. And we can imagine in ancient India, if you wanted to get a message a long distance, and this occurred in ancient Rome as well, I believe, and similar things occurred in other parts of the world, such as in Peru, where they didn't have horses, but they had runners. You had a relay. So you had, if you wanted to get a message to an outpost that was many miles distant, you would have chariots set up with horses at different stages along the way. And one horse would ride, say, 10 miles or however long it would be, to the next chariot. Then the rider would get out, mount the new chariot, the new relay chariot, and keep going. That was the idea. And so that way you could get a long distance without wearing out any one horse. And so the Buddha compares, or I believe it's Sariputta, but it doesn't matter, compares this to compares this kind of relay chariot to the path of practice. So in the path of practice, we, let's say, undertake at the beginning a path that involves ethical practices. So we refrain from killing and stealing and so on. That gets us so far to the next path, next part in that path, which takes us to the next path, next part of the path. So it's not that ethical behavior gets us all the way to the end. It doesn't have that ability. But we do this early practice for the sake of the later ones, because the early practices get us farther along so that we're in the right place and time to get the next practice. Again, the path here is framed as a path that involves chariots going from one stage to the next. And as one gets farther along, one becomes more able. There's also a very famous simile in the Dhammapada that talks really just about this, where it says that, he says, the one who keeps anger in check as it arises, as one would a careening chariot, I call a charioteer. Others are merely rein holders. So in ancient India, chariots were commonplace. They were the cars of the day, although they probably would only have been owned by the wealthy. They were not something that the lower middle class or poor would own. They were something they were expensive in the day, but they were certainly common, and they were considered part of the landscape. And they became used in Buddhism as a general metaphor for the monk or the person in practice. The person in practice is like the charioteer, the person who wants to become a charioteer, who needs to learn how to use the chariot properly, who needs to learn how to use the horse properly, so that all move in the same direction as the charioteer wills, when the charioteer wills, rather than being overtaken by, let's say, anger or hatred, or being overtaken by a horse that's not well trained. An early poem talks in a very interesting way about what we might call a garden of earthly delights. But instead of describing it as a wonder that we should love to be in, instead it describes it as kind of a garden of dangers and snares. Because these earthly delights are the sort of things that take us off the path, that are, we might say, the stuff of Mara that is trying to pull us away from awakening and towards earthly pleasures that are not really for our long-term benefit. And the question comes up in this early poem of how we escape from this garden. And it's said that we escape from the garden through use of our chariot. And it uses a chariot as a large metaphor. So it talks about the chariot being bounded by shame, in the same way that shame in ordinary life keeps us from doing things that we shouldn't be doing, in the same way that the chariot in this garden keeps us, the shame, which is the border of the chariot, keeps us sort of from falling out and going back into the garden. It says that this chariot is upholstered by mindfulness. So the mindfulness braces us and keeps us in place, and he stops us from being hurt. It's sort of holding us in, the chariot, the mindfulness as well. And it says that the chariot is driving us in the direction of right view through the charioteer, which is the Dharma. So the Dharma, the steering wheel, if you like, is the Dharma, is the teaching, it is what is keeping us going forward in the direction of right view. The poem is also special for expressing the fact that both men and women have an equal chance of attaining awakening, or of at least getting close to awakening. This is something that is relatively unusual in the early texts. While it was stated by the Buddha that indeed men and women could both attain awakening, the equality of the sexes in this regard is something that's not touched upon a whole lot. But in this poem it is. And this is something where at the very end of the poem it says, "One who has such a vehicle, that is, one who has such a chariot, whether woman or man, has by means of this vehicle drawn close to Nibbana." And I wonder whether the nun Vajira, who came up with the notion of this chariot as a simile for the non-self character of who we are, I wonder whether she didn't know this poem, whether she hadn't read this poem and taken it to heart, and as a result thought not only of the chariot as as symbolizing non-self, as symbolizing the non-self in practice. In other words, it's a self that's a practiced self. It's a self that we undertake during our practice towards awakening, but also that as a result, the chariot somehow symbolizes the equality of the sexes as regards our ability to attain awakening, or at least get close to awakening. And if so, we can see how Vajira might have taken this poem to heart, and indeed might have wanted to become famous for making this a part of her teaching of the Dharma. So I hope that this has been useful to you. If you want to know more, and I would say want to read more about this or learn more about, in particular, women in early Buddhism, I have an earlier video about women in early Buddhism that I think would be interesting to you, where I get into some of the history of women's problems, as well as their additions and help to the Buddhist path. I'll put a link to it right here. If you're interested in seeing more of these videos, I hope you'll check it out, and I hope all of you will be well.